presenting with Matt Wilson, who is on the faculty at the university.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jenny. And thank you to everyone showing up on this last session of our Wednesday afternoon. So Matt and I will be presenting on what we argue is a productive ambiguity at the heart of cartographic representation, the essentially subjective elements of map design. You know when you see it, good map versus bad map. We've all likely heard versions of this. The moments of engagement between a map maker and a map user often elide simple objective measurement of behavior, emotion, and stimulus response. Instead, we're often left with certain unwritten rules about cartographic design that are contingent and often subject to eye, fashion, and trends. The tendency within more colloquial histories of cartography in the United States is to consider the work of the 20th century as a progressive development of cartographic efficacy, from techniques in hand-drawn mapmaking through functionalist thematic mapping principles to computational cartography and geographic information systems. A key figure of these more colloquial narratives around the history of cartography in the last half of the 20th century has been, of course, Arthur Robinson. We can witness the trouble of cartographic efficacy in Robinson's writing, particularly around what he considers essentially subjective aspects of cartographic design and map use. Today, we'd like to share some thoughts on cartographic education since Robinson's 1952 book, The Look of Maps. In doing so, we argue that alongside this tendency to imagine cartographic efficacy as an area of ever-improving development has been a persistent grappling with what might be meant by cartographic aesthetics. As such, we attempt to conceptualize a wider notion of aesthetics in map design, a conceptualization that incorporates the unintelligible aspects of nonetheless effective cartographic objects and considers the implications of such a conceptualization for the practice of critical mapping. Today, we overview key questions that emerge from our reading of Robinson's Elements of Cartography. The book's first edition, published in 1953, was a companion text to Look of Maps, having been both born from Robinson's dissertation. Elements signaled a major change in academic cartography as it represented a shift from systematic descriptions of drawing and drafting to a post-war conceptualization of, quote, cartography as an intellectual art and science. Subsequent editions were published in 1960, 69, 78, 84, and 95. As this frequency suggests, the popularity of Elements establishes Robinson's role as the leader of mid to late 20th century thinking in Anglophone cartography. And this collection of texts presents us with a corpus to understand key shifts in cartographic technique and mapping technoculture. As Judith Tyner has argued, quote, anyone who took a course on cartography or who taught cartography in the last half of the 20th century learned and taught the gospel according to Robinson, and the gospel was Elements of Cartography. Amen. Indeed, these texts were used to support the training of an entirely new generation of cartographers. As such, we performed discourse analysis on the 6 editions of this textbook to trace the themes around map design, the function of map use, aesthetics, and the processes and characteristics of a good map versus a bad map. Thanks.
All right. So our work proceeds quite simply to read side by side the 6 editions of Elements. We read these in both forward and backward chronology. We've jumped in and out of the editions and located and compared earlier versions of the text, as well as examining how specific passages were left either untouched, altered, or made absent altogether. The attention we paid to the text is born of our very specific readings and our very specific experiences with the project of the map and map making itself. In other words, we're not intending to argue here that this is the definitive critique of the 40+ years of Elements, and neither are we locking ourselves into an accounting of the specific works or phrases, but are instead reading for intent, the effect, and the construction of the argument that Robinson and his co-authors present. So, in other words, your mileage might vary on this particular critique. For example, when juxtaposing the map design chapter of the 1953 edition with the cartographic design chapter of the 1995 edition, we begin to chart these consistencies and breakages. However, we see this emerging in the Look of Maps, indeed, which was a companion text for the more pedagogical work in the first edition of Elements. The intent was to rid the map of these more subjective elements of design. His writing here seems to ring true today, although we would invite other readings. We quote at length because it reminds us of the underlying motivations of what we call the Robinsonian project. Quote, there can be little doubt that if the use of visual techniques to stimulate predictable responses is accepted as within the field of art, then cartography includes artistic techniques. Such techniques obviously should be employed in the attempt to satisfy the functional requirements of a map, for a map is a graphic thing that, by any definition, cannot be visually sterile. The difficulty that arises in interpreting the fairly obvious conclusion is what proportion, if any, of the cartographer's artistic judgment, taste, sense of harmony should enter into their creation. Everyone has probably heard the fatuous statement, and a great majority of us have probably echoed it, quote, "I don't know what is good, but I know what I like." If we proceed on the basis of that grotesque admission, we find ourselves spurning maps with red on them because we don't like red. We champion conventions because they are familiar. We make brightly colored maps because they are brightly colored, whether they convey the information or not. In short, our judgment of technique is based on convention, whim, and fancy. What alternative bases can we adopt? There are two such. One is to standardize everything, end quote. So Robinson's search for and the evaluation of such standards would remain an undercurrent of his project, present even in the final edition of Elements in 1995. Indeed, convention, whim, and fancy were the persistent troubles of map design. In the 1995 edition, we read, quote, "These manipulations remain rather poorly defined and subject to the whim of cartographers performing them," end quote. Over 40 years pass between the first edition and this, the final edition, and yet there are moments of map design that continue to resist our standardization. We continue reading from an earlier passage in this 6th edition, quote, "Good design simply looks right. It is simple, clear, and uncomplicated. Good design is also elegant and does not look contrived," end quote. These moments Robinson marks for us as the, quote, "essentially subjective." Returning to the look of maps, we read, quote, "that many of the aspects of harmony, movement, balance, and proportion seem likely forever to remain essentially subjective insofar as their evaluation is concerned," end quote. Despite generations of spilled ink about cartographic principles, things like thematic mapping, rules, map elements, figure ground, things like cartographic primitives, visual variables, Bertin, and the basic teaching of map making, the rub, the trouble of the essentially subjective remains. You're up.
In what time we have left, we'd like to present our analysis as we attempt to understand the conditions and parameters of the essentially subjective across the 6 editions of Elements. Here, we take note from Judith Tyner and begin with the vitals of each book as a text, year published, total page numbers, changes in authorship, as well as key extensions and to each new edition, like the inclusion of statistics in the 2nd edition, a first mention of automation in the 3rd, a new chapter on color theory in the 4th. The 5th edition offers a first mention of how the Academy is lagging behind the industrial advances, leaving the 6th and final edition to be transformed by the rapid growth of GIS. So with this baseline information in mind, we'll shift to the results of our discourse analysis. Beginning with the chapter titles, we can observe Robinson and his co-authors' evolving thoughts on the principles of cartographic design. They transition from map design, designing the map, cartographic design, graphic presentation and design, graphic design and map making, back to cartographic design. It is within these chapters, as well as the introductory chapters of each edition, that we locate the 6 concepts for today, concepts which we loosely identify as the essentially subjective in map design. More specifically, we read consistencies around how the authors thought about the role of imagination and convenience of use, while also noting departures across the editions around approaches to functional design and generalization. The 6 editions maintain that the elements of cartography operate as an integrated whole, while also preserving a somewhat complicated relationship with the ugly map. Let's first examine passages regarding imagination. The first 3 editions note, quote, "It is not necessary to be an artist or to have the latent talent of an artist to learn to design effectively, but only that it requires, quote, a willingness to exercise imagination." In the 4th and 5th editions, however, we observe that not everyone's imagination is up to producing the type of designs expected by cartographers. The authors now add, quote, "Some inner subjective sense is not a requirement for good design or acceptable design." Robinson et al. Draw an interesting parallel here that similar to how one can be taught written composition or literary composition, one can be taught graphic composition. They continue that even with proper training, not every individual can become creative merely through study. For the 6th edition, the authors retain that graphic techniques are teachable and subject to systematic analysis, however, discontinue their insistence that not everyone or everything can be taught, and instead return to the generalized potential of imagination as, quote, a willingness to think in visual terms. Following such guidelines for tapping into imagination will produce maps which are convenient for map users. With only slight changes of language in between, all 6 editions insist that 1, imagination or imaginative innovation must be disciplined to some extent. 2, that cartography is a field with well-established traditions and conventions. And 3, to operate outside of these conventions would generate inconveniences for map users, which would, and here's key, be, quote, proof of poor design. To avoid such poor designs would require that cartographers come to grips with the functional and instrumental purposes of their maps. The 5th and 6th editions explain how a map is anything that, quote, adds to the geographical understanding of the viewer, and can range from the form of a postage stamp to a mirror-like wall map, which can be used by civilians and military groups alike. In the 1st through the 4th editions, however, the authors offer a much more constricted definition of maps, insisting that maps are, quote, functional, and that they are designed like a bridge or a house for a purpose. And in fact, it would be inappropriate to have a map which serves as an adornment for a wall or an office wall, as in the first 2 editions. Concern with generalization is a prime example of the key tensions between standardization and the cartographer's subjective sensibility, which in the 1st edition, Robinson declared that it would be, quote, next to impossible to provide any useful rules for generalization. By the 3rd edition, though it is argued that some aspects of generalization can be automated, the process regardless remains to be an essentially creative act or process. In the following edition, the authors switched their focus from the messiness of generalization to the robust skill sets required by cartographers to be successfully subjective. In the 6th edition, the challenges of generalization are largely downplayed, only to be thought of as rather poorly defined, leaving the celebration for subjectivity to go unencumbered by detailed justification. Generalization is just one aspect of a mapmaker's efforts to deal with subjectivity. Individual elements of cartography were meant to work as a whole, an integrated whole. More specifically, in the 6th edition, the authors state that if a map is to be effective, quote, the signs must be carefully chosen and fitted together so that they form an integrated whole. This precise sentiment is present in all 6 editions, providing cartographers in training a consistent conceptualization of the map as an agglomeration of parts which are not inherently mappy, but when in certain proximity to one another become a map. From Robinson's 1st edition to the last, the map was understood as a system of individual components that, when well designed, would work together as a singular object. Not doing so would result in a poor map. The editions chart a specific shift in the ramifications of such poor designs. For example, poor design creates ugly maps. Here we see how the idea of this integrated whole of a map has remained while the goals of the cartographer have shifted. We see in the 1st edition, Robinson argues, quote, one of the cartographer's major concerns is to refrain from making the map ugly, and in this respect, he is definitely an artist, albeit in a somewhat negative sense. This quote remained almost completely intact through the first 4 editions, with one notable exception being the replacement of the male gender pronoun with the cartographer in the 4th edition. In the 5th edition, this viewpoint shifts dramatically. The cartographer's job is now to, quote, explore the ramifications of each mapping possibility and to select the most appropriate for the intended communication or task. The look of the map is now seen as a reflection of what needs to be communicated. Rather than merely avoiding a subjectively understood ugliness, map design is recast as an analysis of possibilities in the design process.
All right. So these sort of bullet pace reconsiderations and consolidations of map design for us highlight a particular need for more discussion about cartographic aesthetics, which we note to be both narrow and at times ambiguous throughout the history that we share of the elements of cartography. The disciplining of cartographic aesthetics has meant that new lines of exclusion have been drawn between pretty and ugly, between good at research and good at design, between the functional and the purely emotive. To establish principles of cartography, a quarantine for these more essentially subjective elements had to have been established. As a result, use and function and even notions of interaction itself are married to still unresolved questions around the subjective elements of cartography. The sharpness of these distinctions and the dichotomies that are necessarily produced runs counter to our insistence for a radically open, critical cartography, as well as our continued experimentations and trials of map making and map design. As a conclusion, we offer a rumination on how to stay with these essentially subjective troubles. The point is not to elide the more conventional elements of cartography, but to understand that one part of the political potential in the power of maps lies in precisely these more objective elements. Things like the command to figure ground, a selection of specific symbols, and systems of classification. In our work with community-based organizations, we often encourage our partners to translate their knowledge into the quote-unquote professional look of maps. However, we view these moments of translation to legitimate the concerns of communities through the map object, not only as the end of the process of participatory mapping, but as the means through which these political potentials are explored. And this is where those more essentially subjective elements of the map are most powerful, as they allow for a conversion from the passions of the community organizer, from the coordinated efforts of the mapping facilitator, to the desks of public officials, to the inboxes of corporate developers and real estate speculators. These subjective elements should not be the targets of yet further objective measure by cartographers, but rather should be incorporated into our aesthetics to allow these map designs to articulate and frame new becomings without abandoning all the fantastic experiments in effective and functional cartography. Thank you very much. So we'll end there.
We have time for questions. No?
Yeah, go ahead.
Please.
So finally, you personally, do you think that the aesthetics and so subjective aspect of map should be standardized, or what is the final conclusion, in fact? Critical conclusion?
Do you want me to answer this?
Yeah, I think you have yeah, go for it.
I think the conclusion that we're still trying to operate within is that our tendency, our kind of like anxiousness with cartography, is to constantly try to perform a evaluative measure on the things that we really love about mapping, right? So we lean toward the map, we trace it with our fingertips, and yet we try to find ways that we can have that experience across all maps, right? That we can create some standards that might allow many individuals to share those same effective emotive responses to our cartographic products. I think the tendency then is for us to try to standardize and simplify and create sort of measures or evaluative measures to make those things possible across all of our maps. And Robinson's and his co-authors sort of 40 plus years of writing the elements of cartography, you see that kind of crystallization, that kind of attempt to grapple with the more subjective and interpretive elements of mapping. And their response is largely, I think, and I think Amber and I share this sort of conclusion, the response is largely to kind of demystify the map. Perhaps actually take out of the map those things that actually make the map powerful. And so I think we want to be very careful about attempting to find a definitive conclusion about what provides that really important moment of the map reading process. I think we should probably accept there's a plurality of approaches to the ways that we respond to different map objects. And I think we should resist any sort of techniques produced by the largely academic cartographers to produce a standard way to evaluate those more interpretive moments of the map. So I think we should, as Donna Haraway would say, sort of stay with the trouble. We should sort of thickly allow these things to just inhabit the way that we think about maps, and not try to simplify that map event by standardizing the experience of map reading. I think there have been huge advances in functional cartography, but I also think we have to allow those more subjective elements to just populate in multiple different ways. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.